Story 1. I am a Navajo, and I have heard many stories about skinwalkers. My father told me that when he was young, his family lived in an area where there was no electricity or running water. He said it was just like the old days for them. One night, my dad's older brother came home from work and wanted to go hunting rabbits with him. They went out into the dark desert with their flashlights looking for rabbit eyes, the only way you can see them. As they walked around, they saw something standing on top of a hill about 200 yards away from them. It looked like a person, but had long hair all over its body. They thought it might be someone who needed help, so they called out to it, but got no response. Then suddenly this thing started walking towards them at a fast pace, while making some kind of noise that sounded like a who sound. At first they thought maybe it was someone playing tricks on them until this thing stopped right in front of them. My dad said that whatever this thing was, it stood up straight like a human being, and made eye contact with both of them as if studying their faces. The moonlight shined down on its face, revealing large black eyes, which frightened my dad even more than anything else, because he knew then what he saw wasn't human. He also noticed that its mouth moved differently than ours do when we talk, almost as if trying to imitate our language without actually speaking any words. This scared him so much that he ran back home, leaving his brother behind alone. When my dad arrived home, everyone could tell by the look on his face how terrified he was. His mother asked him what happened, and why did he leave his brother behind. All my dad could say is, "There is something evil outside." Everyone became very quiet after hearing those words, because deep inside themselves, each one already knew what it must have been. A skinwalker. My dad's older brother never came back home that night. He was found the next morning, lying dead in the desert with his body all torn apart and covered in blood. My dad said he could not explain what happened to him because there were no signs of any kind of animal attack or anything else for that matter. After this incident, my father became very interested in learning more about these creatures, so he asked around among our people who knew about them. This occurred right near one of the major national parks in the area. Story 2. I was in the Uinta National Forest, and I had been out there for a few days by myself. I have done this many times before, so it wasn't anything new to me. The first couple of nights were uneventful, but on the third night is when things started getting weird. It was about midnight or so, and I heard something walking around my campsite. My fire had died down quite a bit at that point, but there was still enough light from the coals to see some shapes moving around outside of my tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or elk since they are common in that area, but then whatever it was came right up next to my tent and just stood there for what seemed like forever, probably only about 5 minutes. After a while, it moved away from my tent and back into the woods, where I couldn't see it anymore. The next morning after breakfast, I decided to go hiking along one of the trails near my campsite. As soon as I got onto the trail, though, all these birds started going crazy with their calls, which made me feel really uneasy for some reason. They would fly off whenever they saw me coming towards them, then land again once they felt safe enough to do so. After hiking for about an hour or two without seeing any wildlife except those birds flying around everywhere, suddenly everything went quiet again, except this time, instead of hearing bird calls off in distance like before, now all you could hear were these strange, high-pitched screams coming from somewhere nearby, followed by low growling sounds afterwards, which sounded very close by too. Needless to say, this freaked me out pretty bad because nothing should make noises like that, especially not while you're alone deep inside wilderness. So naturally, being scared shitless already at this point, decided turn back, head straight back towards camp, hoping maybe whatever making those creepy sounds wouldn't follow behind. Story 3. I was camping with my girlfriend at the time, in a national park. We were out on a hike and I had to take a piss, so we stopped for me to do that. As soon as I unzipped my pants, there was this awful smell of rotting meat or something similar. It smelled like death, and it hit us all at once. We looked around but didn't see anything immediately wrong, so I started pissing anyway. But then we heard rustling from some bushes behind us and saw movement through the trees maybe 20 yards away from where we were standing. It seemed like whatever it was must have been pretty big because the branches of these trees are probably about 15 feet off the ground. Yet they were shaking violently as if someone much taller than either of us was pushing them aside while walking towards us. The sound got louder and closer until suddenly everything went silent again, except for our breathing, which sounded really loud. Now that nothing else could be heard over it anymore, the wind also died down. Then, after what felt like forever, without any other noise whatsoever coming from anywhere nearby, crack! A branch snapped right next to where we stood, followed by another one breaking just moments later. My heart raced faster than ever before when suddenly two glowing red eyes appeared in front of me, only inches away, staring directly into mine. They blinked slowly twice before disappearing, completely leaving only darkness behind them. I was so scared that I couldn't move. It felt like my legs were frozen in place, and I could only stand there, staring into the darkness where those eyes had been just moments before. Then suddenly, something touched me on the shoulder, a hand. A cold, bony hand with long fingers and sharp nails. I screamed as loud as possible while turning around quickly to see what it was. But when I did, nothing. There was no one behind us at all. My girlfriend asked if everything was okay because she heard me scream but hadn't seen anything herself. She said. She also mentioned how weird it smelled here now too, which made her feel sick to her stomach almost immediately after smelling it for herself. We decided to leave right away since we didn't know what else might be out there, or if whatever this thing is would come back again later tonight when we're sleeping in our tent. As soon as we got back to camp, though, everything seemed normal again. No more strange smells or sounds anywhere nearby anymore either. We were both pretty shaken up by what happened earlier, so we decided to go back home the next day instead of staying for another night like originally planned. I couldn't sleep at all that night because every little noise outside our tent made me jump out of my skin. The following morning, as soon as it was light enough outside, we packed everything up and left immediately without even eating breakfast first, which is really unusual for us since we love food. We just wanted to get away from there as fast as possible. I've never been back to that place again either, not even once. It's been over 10 years now, but I still remember this experience very clearly. Story 4. My husband and I were driving through the mountains of West Virginia. It was around 11:30 at night, and we had just passed a small town called Raynell. We were on Route 60, heading towards Gauley Bridge. We rounded a curve in the road when my husband said, "What is that?" He slowed down as he got closer to it. At first, I thought it was a deer or something like that, but then I realized how tall this thing was standing up on two legs. It turned its head towards us and looked right into our headlights. I screamed for him to keep going because I didn't want whatever it was coming after us. My husband sped up as fast as he could go without losing control of the car. As we drove away from it, we saw it turn back around and walk off into the woods. It took me a while before I could calm down enough to talk about what happened with my husband again. When we finally did talk about it, he told me that he thinks what we saw might have been Bigfoot. He has always believed in them but never actually seen one until now. After doing some research online, I found out there have been other sightings in this area too, so maybe they are real after all. Story 5. My husband and I were driving back from visiting my family in New Mexico. We decided to take the scenic route through Arizona so we could visit the Grand Canyon on our way home. It was about 2 a.m. when we got to the park entrance. But since it was winter time, there wasn't anyone at the gate. So we drove into the park and parked by one of those pull-off areas that overlooks a canyon. We had been talking for a while when suddenly everything went silent. The wind stopped blowing, no crickets or anything making noise anymore, just dead silence. Then all of a sudden, this horrible smell hit us like a ton of bricks. My husband said he thought something must have died nearby because it smelled like rotting flesh mixed with sulfur. I looked out towards where the smell seemed to be coming from, downwind, and saw what appeared to be two glowing red eyes looking back at me. They were probably about 3 feet off the ground, but they didn't move or blink or anything. They just stared right at me. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of animal that had gotten caught in headlights somewhere down below us, but then I realized whatever this thing was would have had to have been huge, because its eyes were easily visible even though they were several hundred yards away. After staring at each other for what felt like forever, but couldn't have been more than a minute, my husband finally convinced me that we needed to get out of there before whatever this thing was came up after us. We jumped back in the car and drove as fast as we could out of there. We didn't stop again until we got to a hotel about an hour away from the park. I've never been so scared in my life. I don't know what it was that we saw, but whatever it was had glowing red eyes and smelled like rotting flesh mixed with sulfur. Story 6. So I'm a pretty avid outdoorsman and love camping, hiking, fishing, etc. So when my buddy invited me to go on a backpacking trip in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, I was super excited. We planned to hike up past Titcomb Basin and camp at Island Lake for 3 nights before heading back down. The first day, we hiked about 12 miles through some beautiful country until we got to our destination, which was just as amazing as expected. The lake is surrounded by huge granite cliffs with waterfalls coming off them all over the place. We set up camp and started cooking dinner around dusk when things started getting weird. It sounded like someone was throwing rocks into the lake from above us, but there wasn't anyone else around that we could see or hear, so it didn't make sense where they would be coming from. Then, later that night after dark, while sitting next to the fire talking quietly, I started hearing what sounded like a woman crying or moaning from up in the cliffs. I didn't say anything to my buddy at first because I thought maybe it was just an animal, but then he said, "What is that noise?" And we both got quiet and listened for a few minutes while it continued. It definitely sounded like someone crying, not really loud but very distinct. It would go on for about 30 seconds, then stop for a minute or two before starting again. This went on until around midnight when we decided to get some sleep. The next day, we hiked up above Island Lake and fished all day with no other incidents except for seeing some mountain goats way up high on the cliffs, which were pretty cool. That night after dark, the same thing happened as the previous night, with more rock throwing into the lake, followed by more crying, moaning sounds coming from different directions this time. The rocks being thrown were small enough that they weren't making much of a splash, so they must have been close by, yet there still wasn't anyone else around us anywhere that we could see or hear during daylight hours. This went on again until late into the night and kept us awake most of the time, even though we tried ignoring it as best as possible, since there wasn't much else we could do about it anyway without leaving our camp unattended in bear country. On our 3rd day there, things seemed normal during daylight hours while fishing and exploring around, but once again after dark, everything changed. We heard more rock throwing into the lake, along with voices talking quietly back and forth between each other, although too far away to make out any words clearly. Then later in the evening, while sitting next to our fire watching stars, something came walking down through our campsite right behind where my tent was set up and stopped for a few seconds before continuing on. It was dark, and we couldn't see anything but heard it walking through the trees. It sounded like a person walking with heavy boots on, so I thought maybe someone had hiked up there to camp overnight, but that didn't make sense since they would have been throwing rocks into the lake during daylight hours as well if that were the case. We decided to go ahead and pack up our gear early in order to get an early start back down off the mountain, because at this point we both felt very uncomfortable about staying another night under those circumstances. We left everything set up except for my tent, which we packed away while still leaving his out, just in case something happened while we were gone. On our way back down after hiking only about 2 miles or so from Island Lake, I started feeling really sick all of a sudden, nauseous and light-headed along with some mild chest pain. My buddy said he wasn't feeling good either, although not quite as bad as me. I've never experienced altitude sickness before, even though I've been much higher than where we were at, and it didn't make sense why we would be feeling sick now after being there for 2 days already. We stopped and rested for a while, but I just kept getting worse, so we decided to keep going down as fast as possible. We made it back to the trailhead in about 4 hours, which was a really good time considering how bad I felt at that point. As soon as we got back down off the mountain, my symptoms started subsiding until they were completely gone by the next day. I don't know what happened up there or who was messing with us, but I've never experienced anything like that before and hope to never again. Story 7. My friend and I were driving around in a national park at night. We had just left the campsite where we had been hanging out with some friends, but they went to bed early, so we decided to go for a drive. It was probably about 11:30 p.m. when this happened. We drove down one of the roads that leads into the park, which is surrounded by dense forest on both sides. As we came up over a hill, my friend slammed on his brakes because there was something standing in the middle of the road ahead of us. It looked like it could have been an animal or something, but as soon as our headlights hit it, it turned its head towards us and stared right at us. The eyes reflected back red from our lights, and then it darted off into the woods. I've never seen anything move so fast before in my life. Whatever it was must have been only 10 feet away from us when we saw it, because within seconds after seeing its eyes reflect back red from our lights, all I could see through my windshield was darkness again. The next thing I knew, my friend started screaming, "What did you do?" And he threw his car into reverse and sped backwards down the road until he got far enough away that he felt safe stopping again. When I asked him what happened, he said that whatever we saw wasn't normal, and that's why he freaked out like that. He told me not to tell anyone else about this because nobody would believe us anyway. Story 8. So, I'm going to preface this by saying that it's been a long time since I've thought about this, and I don't remember all the details. It was probably 20 years ago or so. I grew up in northern Utah, and we would often go camping with my family. One summer when I was around 10, my dad was driving, and we were in the middle of nowhere. It was dark, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky, so it was still pretty light out. I remember looking up at the stars as my dad drove down this dirt road when suddenly he stopped. I looked forward to see what had happened and saw that about 50 yards ahead of us, there were 2 glowing red eyes right next to each other on the side of the road. They were probably about 3 feet off the ground, maybe a little higher. My dad put his hand over my chest to keep me from moving, and he just stared at the eyes. After a few seconds, they started to move towards us, and my dad hit the gas. We drove back home that night instead of camping because we were all so freaked out. I've thought about it many times over the years and have never been able to come up with an explanation for what happened. Story 9. My wife and I were driving back from visiting family in Colorado. We had driven all night. We left at 2 a.m. on the 6th of July. It was about 8:30 or so when we got to the Utah border. My wife was sleeping, so I woke her up as soon as we crossed into Utah, because she has never been there before. We drove through Moab and then went north towards Salt Lake City. As you leave Moab, it is a long stretch of road with nothing but desert on both sides for miles and miles until you get to Green River, which is about an hour away. I have always loved this drive because it's very peaceful, not much traffic if any at all most times that I've gone through there. This time, however, would be different than any other time that I've made this trip. It was probably around 9. I was driving on the highway, and I saw a humanoid figure walking upright along the side of the road. It looked like it had no face or eyes, but I could see its silhouette against the headlights of my car. It didn't seem to notice me at all as it walked past, and I sped up to get away from it. I didn't tell my wife what I saw because she was already scared enough as it is. We drove for about 10 minutes, and then we got to the town of Green River, which is where we stopped for gas. We pulled into a gas station and parked at one of the pumps. As soon as I turned off the car, my wife said, "Did you see that?" And I asked her what she meant. She told me that when we were driving through Moab, she had seen something walking along the side of the road. She described it exactly how I saw it. Humanoid figure with no face or eyes, walking upright on 2 legs. It seemed like whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, but also not an animal either. After hearing her say this, I knew that there must be some kind of explanation for what we both saw. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us because we were tired from driving all night? Story 10. My friend and I were driving through a national park in the Southwest. It was about 2 a.m. We had been driving for hours and it was very dark out. We came around a bend in the road when suddenly our headlights illuminated something that looked like a man standing on all 4s in the middle of the road. It stood up on 2 legs as soon as our lights hit it, but it didn't move at all. It just stood there staring at us with its head tilted to one side. My friend slammed on his brakes and swerved to avoid hitting whatever this thing was. As we passed by it, I got a good look at its face. Its eyes were glowing red, and they seemed to be reflecting light from our headlights, even though they weren't shining directly into them anymore. We drove away quickly after that because we were both pretty freaked out by what we saw. Story 11. I was in Joshua Tree National Park, California. I had been hiking all day and decided to take a break for lunch at one of the campsites. It was about 1:30 p.m. when I started eating my sandwich. About 5 minutes into my meal, I heard something rustling behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there, so I just assumed it was an animal, or maybe even another hiker that got lost from their group. A few more minutes passed by, and then suddenly everything went silent. No birds chirping, no wind blowing through the trees, nothing but silence. This is when things started getting weird. As soon as the silence hit, a strong smell of sulfur filled the air, followed by this high-pitched scream that sounded like someone being murdered mixed with nails on a chalkboard. I quickly got up and looked around to see what was going on, but there was nothing there. I decided it would be best if I left the area, so I packed up my things and started heading back towards the trailhead. As soon as I got about 100 yards away from where this happened, everything went back to normal. The birds were chirping again, wind blowing through the trees, etc. To this day, I have no idea what caused that experience, but it definitely scared me enough to leave the area immediately. Story 12. My family and I were camping in Joshua Tree National Park. We had been hiking all day and decided to stop at a place called Hidden Valley for the night. It was getting dark fast, so we quickly set up camp, cooked dinner over an open fire, then went to bed early because it was cold outside. I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. I grabbed my flashlight and walked away from our tent into some nearby bushes where I did my business before heading back towards camp when something caught my eye off in the distance. At first, I thought maybe it was just another camper out there with their own light. But as I got closer, realized that whatever this thing was didn't have any clothes on or anything else that would reflect light like a person might have if they were wearing reflective clothing or carrying a flashlight themselves. I stopped dead in my tracks as it turned its head towards me without moving any other part of its body, while still looking down at what appeared to be some kind of animal carcass laying on the ground next to it, which looked like either a deer or coyote judging by size alone, since couldn't see much detail due to how far away from us this thing actually was. Its eyes glowed red under our flashlights, then suddenly went black again as it dropped onto all fours and ran off into the night faster than anything should be able to, especially considering how rocky terrain is around here, making even walking difficult, sometimes let alone running full speed through brushy areas like this one must have been doing right now. We quickly made our way back into our tent after seeing whatever that thing was run off into darkness, thinking maybe if we stayed inside, nothing bad would happen until morning came. I'm not sure what it was, but it had me so spooked. What do you think it could have been? Story 13. I was driving home from work one night and saw a large, dark figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down thinking it was a person who had been hit by another car. As I got closer to it, I realized that this thing wasn't human at all. It stood about 7 feet tall, with long arms and legs, no neck or head that I could see, and it was completely black. I could see no facial features or anything like that. It just stood there in the middle of the road, not moving at all. As I got closer to it, my headlights illuminated its body, and I saw that it had no clothes on either. It was just a naked creature standing in front of me. I stopped my car about 20 feet away from this thing and honked my horn several times, trying to get its attention, but it didn't move at all. It just stood there staring straight ahead with its arms hanging down by its sides. After a few minutes of sitting there watching this thing, I decided to drive around it because I didn't want to hit whatever this thing was with my car. So I slowly drove off the side of the road and passed by this creature as close as possible without hitting it. As soon as I passed by this thing, it suddenly turned towards me and started running after my car. This scared the hell out of me, so I sped up and tried to get away from whatever this thing was chasing me. I looked back in my rearview mirror for a second and saw that this creature had caught up with my car already. But then something even more strange happened. I saw that this creature had caught up with my car already. But then something even more strange happened. The creature suddenly stopped running and just stood there in the middle of the road again. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I slowed down to get a better look at it. As soon as I got closer, this thing started running after me again. It was like it wanted to catch up with my car, but didn't want to pass by me for some reason. This time, however, instead of chasing after me on foot, this creature jumped over my car. It literally leaped over my moving vehicle without touching it at all. This scared the hell out of me so much that I sped off as fast as possible trying to get away from whatever this thing was. After driving for about 10 minutes or so, I looked back in my rearview mirror and saw that this creature wasn't following me anymore. I'm not sure what I saw that night, but it definitely wasn't human. It was a tall, dark figure with no clothes on and had the ability to jump over my car while chasing after me. The only thing I can think of is that this creature must have been some kind of supernatural being or something like that, because there's no way any normal person could do what this thing did. I've never seen anything like it before in my life and hope I never see anything like it again.